September 21st, 1930. A house called Woodcrest stands empty in Pennsylvania, while its master lies dead in a home his own wife called ugly. This is a forensic investigation into a grift that cost a bloodline $500 million. Not a political lecture, not a celebration of wealth. A story told through the architecture of deception, through the labor of invisible hands, through 35 pages of a will that turned every heir into a prisoner. The monthly electricity bill at that ugly New Jersey house? $7. The inheritance tax, Pennsylvania alone assessed against the fortune hidden behind it, $31 million in 1930, roughly $500 million in today's money. The dynasty that fortune built, and trapped in equal measure, $15 billion as of today. This is not a story about soup. This is a story about what one man's need for control can do to a bloodline. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the dark machinery behind American dynasties, please like this video and subscribe. Every forensic case begins the same way, not with ambition, not with invention, with a body, and the question of where it truly belonged. The address on the death certificate read Cinnaminson Township, Burlington County, New Jersey. A plain brick house with a mansard roof, 7 acres surrounded by truck farms. The monthly gas and electric bill, $7. John Thompson Dorrance, sole owner of the Campbells Soup Company, one of the wealthiest men in America, died there on September 21st, 1930, of heart disease. He was 56 years old. He did not choose to die there. The family had spent part of that summer at Bar Harbor, Maine, a third residence they kept for the season. When they returned in early fall, Woodcrest was still being prepared for the winter. So Dorrance stopped at the old house in New Jersey, the one his own wife would later describe under oath as ordinary and very ugly. It was there, in the house he had spent 5 years pretending was still his home, that his heart gave out. His executives did exactly what his will instructed. They filed the probate documents in Burlington County, identifying the deceased as a resident of Cinnaminson Township. Then, Pennsylvania sent a letter. The Commonwealth had been watching Woodcrest since 1925. It appointed an appraiser, valued the estate at just under $200 million, and assessed an inheritance tax of $31,465,000. Roughly $500 million in today's money. The executives fought it. They appealed to the Orphans Court of Delaware County. The court sided with them. Pennsylvania took the case to its Supreme Court. In September of 1932, the ruling came down. Dorrance, it held, had been domiciled in Pennsylvania. The evidence was not ambiguous. 51 rooms, 16 servants, children enrolled in local Pennsylvania schools. A social life conducted entirely from Radnor. A man's conduct, the court ruled, speaks louder than his paperwork. The executives appealed to the United States Supreme Court. It declined to intervene. They paid Pennsylvania $14,394,000, plus interest, plus a $4 million bond against amounts still to come. Then New Jersey made its own claim. The state had its own evidence. Dorrance had voted there, banked there, run his company from Camden, insisted in his own will that he was a citizen of New Jersey. The tax commissioner assessed a separate inheritance tax of $12,247,000. The executives argued the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had already settled the matter. You cannot tax a man twice for the privilege of dying. New Jersey disagreed. Its prerogative court upheld the assessment in 1934. Its Supreme Court affirmed in 1935. The executives returned to Washington. In December of 1935, Justice Louis Brandeis delivered the opinion. The federal judiciary had no authority to intervene. John Thompson Dorrance ended up domiciled in 2 states simultaneously. Pennsylvania collected over 14 million. New Jersey collected over 12 million. The combined amount actually paid? More than $26 million. Roughly $430 million in today's money. Had he simply chosen one state and declared it honestly, the figure would have been roughly half. The case became a landmark in American tax law. Estate planners still cite it today as a warning. He had built a fortune on a single principle: remove what is unnecessary. Water from soup, distractions from a product line, partners from a company. But in the matter of his own death, he had added something that did not need to be there. A second home, maintained for no purpose other than deception. It doubled the bill. He was not simply a chemist who became a billionaire. He was a man who had mastered the art of appearing to be somewhere he was not. In a courtroom, they called it fraud on domicile. In plain language, there is another word for it: a grifter in a tailored suit. The scheme had failed, but the damage was only beginning. He left behind a will, 35 pages, written to control what he could no longer control in life. What it contained would bind the Dorrance family for the rest of the 20th century. But to understand what that will demanded, and why the family had no choice but to obey, you first have to understand what Dorrance had spent 30 years building. Not just the company, the empire behind the label. Bristol, Pennsylvania, November 11th, 1873. John Thompson Dorrance was born into a family with means, sharp, restless, and consumed by a single question: what happens when you take something out? He earned a Bachelor of Science from MIT in 1895, then sailed to Germany to pursue a doctorate at the University of Göttingen. While abroad, he spent time in Paris, not at the museums, not at the galleries, in the restaurants, studying soup. He noticed something that stayed with him. Europeans treated soup as essential, a daily necessity, not a luxury. Americans, by and large, did not. Dorrance believed the reason was practical. In the United States, prepared soups were expensive, heavy, and sold in oversized cans. A single 32-ounce container weighed several pounds. Most of what you were buying was water. A can that cost a housewife more than 30 cents contained perhaps 8 cents of actual food. The rest was weight. The rest was freight. The rest was shelf space. If someone could remove the water, preserve the flavor and the nutrition in a can roughly 1/3 the size, the customer could add the water at home, and the price could fall to 10 cents. The market, Dorrance concluded, was wide open. After completing his doctorate in 1897, he received teaching offers from Columbia, Cornell, Bryn Mawr, and Göttingen itself. 4 institutions, 4 invitations to a quiet, distinguished academic life. He declined all 4. Instead, he traveled to Camden, New Jersey, and walked into the offices of his uncle, Arthur Dorrance, president of the Joseph Campbell Preserve Company. Arthur was skeptical. His nephew was too much the scholar, he thought, not the kind of man who would find purpose packing tomatoes and jellies for a living. But John was persistent. He offered to accept a salary of $7.50 per week, roughly $280 in today's money, and to equip his own laboratory entirely out of pocket. Arthur gave in. It would turn out to be the most consequential hiring decision in the history of the American food industry. Dorrance built a small lab inside the Camden plant and set to work. By 1897, he had developed the formula. Within 2 years, the first cans of Campbell's condensed soup appeared on store shelves. The original variety was tomato. It sold immediately. By the early 1900s, the company offered 21 varieties, every one of them priced at a dime. A can that once cost more than 30 cents now cost 10. The math was not complicated, but nobody else had done it. Dorrance was a scientist. He was also a businessman with an instinct that would define everything he touched and eventually destroy what he loved most. The instinct was this: remove what is unnecessary. In 1898, a company executive named Herberton Williams attended the annual Cornell versus Penn football game. He returned to Camden captivated by the vivid red and white of Cornell's new uniforms. Williams persuaded the company to abandon its black and orange label in favor of that same color pairing. A scheme chosen on a Saturday afternoon in Ithaca, New York, has endured for more than 125 years. 2 years later, Campbell entered a soup competition at the 1900 Paris International Exposition. The company's representatives did not bring a chef. They packed cans of condensed soup in their luggage, prepared them on site, and won a bronze medal for product excellence. Dorrance had the medal pressed onto the label. It has been there ever since. In 1904, a Philadelphia artist named Grace Drayton sketched a pair of rosy-cheeked children for a series of streetcar advertisements. The Campbell kids gave the brand a warmth that no label design could have manufactured alone. While the brand was building its face, Dorrance was building his position. He became a director and vice president in 1900. From that point forward, he used every dollar he could find to purchase stock from his uncle and from other partners. The method was quiet, patient, relentless. Inside the company, the arithmetic was understood by everyone. Dorrance knew the recipes. He had engineered the process. If the other shareholders refused his offers, he could walk out the door, open a rival operation, and dismantle them. Whether the threat was ever spoken directly is unclear. The result was not. Share by share, year after year, John Thompson Dorrance was buying his way to total ownership. When Arthur retired in 1914, his nephew succeeded him as president. The following year, Dorrance purchased the remaining interest held by the Campbell family itself and became the company's sole proprietor. The man who had arrived at $7.50 a week now controlled an enterprise that was redefining the American kitchen. He was 42 years old. He had removed the water. He had removed the competitors. He had removed every outside voice. He was only getting started. And the same mind that had made him untouchable in business was already turning toward a new problem. What happens when you take the government out? The answer required a house, not a home, a structure built for a single purpose, to make the most powerful tax authorities in America look in the wrong direction. Its name was Woodcrest, and it was 51 rooms of calculated deception. Before there was a reason to hide, there had to be something worth hiding. By 1904, the Campbell factory in Camden was producing 16 million cans of soup a year. 7 years earlier, it had been packing tomatoes and jellies for a regional market. Dorrance had reshaped the entire operation in his image. He was not interested in preserves. He was not interested in ketchup. He was not interested in anything that was not soup. The jams, the condiments, the pickled goods, phased out. His reasoning was the same reasoning he had applied in the laboratory. A company that tries to do too many things will do none of them well. Campbell would make soup. It would make it better than anyone else, and it would make sure that every household in the United States knew the name. In 1906, Dorrance married Ethel Mallinckrodt in Baltimore. She came from a prominent Maryland family. Together, they would have 5 children, 4 daughters, Eleanor, Ethel, Charlotte, and Margaret, and 1 son, John Jr., born in 1919. The marriage placed Dorrance inside the social world of the Eastern establishment, but he was not a man built for social occasions. He was at the factory before dawn, involved in every detail, from the varieties of tomatoes grown on the company's research farms to the precise wording of a streetcar advertisement. In 1911, Campbell's soup reached California for the first time. Distributing a perishable product across 3,000 miles of rail lines and warehouses was a genuine logistical achievement in the early 20th century. Campbell became one of the first food companies to supply the entire nation. Dorrance pressed forward. In 1912, he launched an agricultural program, putting the company in the business of growing its own tomatoes. He wanted to control quality from the seed to the shelf. During the 8 summer weeks of the harvest, the entire Camden plant was devoted to a single task: processing tomatoes into soup and juice. Nothing else was produced until the crop was in. In 1915, he acquired the Franco-American Food Company, a New Jersey producer of canned pasta and soups, in operation since 1886. Franco-American had been the first company in America to manufacture canned soup commercially. Dorrance did not buy it to preserve its soup line. He bought it to absorb a competitor and take its distribution network. The Franco-American name was gradually retired from soup and reassigned to pasta. In 1922, the company was reincorporated under a new name. It had been the Joseph Campbell Preserve Company. Now it was the Campbell Soup Company. The word soup, placed directly in the corporate identity, was a declaration. This was not a general-purpose canning operation. Dorrance wanted no confusion on the matter. By the late 1920s, Campbell was selling more soup than any company on earth. During the war years, nearly half of all sales had come from just 2 products: tomato soup and tomato juice. One formula, one can. A price that nearly anyone could afford. Dorrance sat on the boards of banks and railroads. He held memberships in scientific societies on both sides of the Atlantic. He had received the French Legion of Honor. By any measure, he was among the wealthiest men in the United States. His fortune, at its height, exceeded $100 million, the equivalent of roughly $1.8 billion in today's money. And it was growing, every quarter, every year, with no outside shareholders to answer to, no board with the power to question him, no partner left to object. He had removed them all, which meant the fortune was entirely his, which meant the tax, when it came, would be entirely his too. Pennsylvania had been watching. In 1925, Dorrance moved his family to a 51-room estate on the Philadelphia Main Line. The architect was Horace Trumbauer, the most sought-after residential architect in the city. Woodcrest was not built to impress. It was built to contain. 238 acres, local stone and limestone trim, half-timbered wings rising 3 stories above the Philadelphia Main Line. The house sat surrounded by the estates of bankers, railroad magnates, and old money families who had occupied this stretch of Pennsylvania for generations. Dorrance had not been born into that world. He had bought his way in. The estate had been built at the turn of the century for James W. Paul, Jr., a managing partner at Drexel & Company, and the son-in-law of financier Anthony Drexel. Trumbauer's finest houses were built for men who had inherited their position. This one was purchased by a man who had invented his. Dorrance paid approximately $1 million, renovations and furnishings included. Roughly $17 million in today's money. His first instruction to the craftsman? Strip the interior. The dark Victorian finishes were removed entirely. Room by room, through a 51-room house, workers replaced every surface. Bedrooms, bathrooms, reception rooms, servant quarters, nursery, library, billiard room. 51 rooms. Every finish replaced, every detail chosen to say, this family had always belonged here. In their place came lighter Elizabethan finishes, cleaner lines, higher ceilings. The aesthetic language of Old English nobility applied to a house built on condensed soup. The men who carried out that work were not named in any society column. They were the plasterers and stonemasons, the Finnish carpenters and decorative painters who moved through the rooms of Woodcrest long before the Dorrance family arrived. Their work created the illusion. Dorrance's lawyers would later argue the illusion was real. On November 14, 1925, the family moved in. Every piece of personal property was transported from Cinnaminson, New Jersey. The children enrolled in local schools. Their friendships, their social world, all of it shifted to Radnor. This was not a country retreat. It was a relocation, and it required a machine to run it. The machine had 28 moving parts. 16 servants staffed the interior. 10 to 12 more worked the grounds. Consider what 16 people inside a house actually means. A head butler managed the household, coordinating staff schedules, overseeing formal service, receiving guests at the door. A housekeeper controlled domestic operations, linen inventories, cleaning schedules, the daily logistics of a house that entertained at a level that made the society pages. A head cook ran the kitchen. 3 services, 7 days a week, every week of the year. Kitchen maids prepared ingredients before dawn. Parlor maids maintained the reception rooms, polishing silver, arranging flowers, resetting rooms between events. A lady's maid attended to Ethel Dorrance personally, her wardrobe, her correspondence, her preparation for the teas and garden parties that drew admiring columns in the press. A nursemaid supervised the children. Footmen stood at table during formal dinners, moved furniture for parties, and carried luggage when the family traveled, to Bar Harbor, to New York, to the 3rd residence they kept for the season. A laundress managed the washing. Linens, uniforms, the continuous cycle of cloth required to keep a household of this scale presentable. Outside, the grounds required their own hierarchy. A head gardener oversaw 238 acres. Beneath him, undergardeners, maintaining lawns and the kitchen garden through every season of the Pennsylvania year. A stablemaster managed the horses. Grooms attended them daily. A chauffeur, at minimum 2, maintained and operated the 7 automobiles housed in the garage on the grounds. Workers maintained the cow barn and the milk house, producing dairy for the household's own consumption. 26 people, 28 on a full week, all of them employed to maintain a house that officially was not John Thompson Dorrance's home. Their wages, their daily presence. The enrollment papers of 5 children in local Radnor schools. Every one of these was a thread in an evidentiary fabric. Pennsylvania's lawyers would later pull it apart, stitch by stitch, in a courtroom. The deception required the servants. The servants destroyed the deception. Meanwhile, 12 miles away in Cinnaminson, the numbers told the opposite story. Before the move, Dorrance had employed 10 servants at the New Jersey property. After November 1925, the number fell to 4. After his mother and his sister both died there in the late 1920s, it fell again to 2. Household spending at Cinnaminson dropped from nearly $29,000 a year to roughly $6,500. The monthly gas and electric bill came to about $7. $7 for the legal residence of the man who had just spent $17 million on a house 12 miles away. In the evenings, Dorrance sat in a house built for a Drexel, ran a company that made him wealthier every quarter, and refused every approach from investment bankers who wanted to take Campbell public. Time magazine would later note that many a banker's mouth had watered at the thought of bringing such an enterprise to market. Not one ever managed to get a meeting. Dorrance wanted no outside ownership. He wanted no scrutiny. He was willing to maintain a $7 electricity bill in a house he barely visited to protect a fortune he intended to outlast him by a century. He was 56 years old. The scheme he had built so carefully was 5 years from collapse, and the bill would come to more than $30 million. Before the collapse, There was the will, 35 pages, written not as a gift to his family, but as a set of instructions for how they would spend the rest of their lives. The reading took place in Mount Holly, New Jersey. The year, 1930. The document, 35 pages. The heirs gathered to learn what John Thompson Dorrance had decided their lives would look like. He had divided his fortune into 6 parts. His wife, Ethel, received 1/4. His only son, John Jr., known as Jack, received 1/4 as well, along with his father's personal library and a grandfather clock. Each of the 4 daughters received 1/8. Even 1/8 of the Dorrance estate was a sum most men would never see in a lifetime. At the time the will was filed, the total fortune was estimated at $150 million. Roughly $2.7 billion in today's money. But the money was not the point. The stock was. Dorrance had spent his life refusing every offer to sell or dilute his ownership of Campbell's Soup. In death, he intended to continue that refusal. The will instructed his executives in the strongest possible language not to sell the company's shares. If a sale were ever found necessary, it was to come only after what Dorrance called the greatest deliberation. And every share was to be sold in a single block, no piecemeal liquidation, no outside investors acquiring a foothold, one transaction at a time. The structure went deeper. When each of Dorrance's children eventually died, the stock would not pass to their spouses or dissolve into other estates. It would flow to his grandchildren. And Jack's heirs, the male line, the one carrying the Dorrance name, would receive double the allotment given to the heirs of each daughter. The will guaranteed that the male line would always hold the largest share. There was one more calculation buried inside the choice of New Jersey residency, one that had nothing to do with tax rates. Under Pennsylvania law, a widow was entitled to 1/3 of her husband's personal property, regardless of what any will said. New Jersey had no such provision. By maintaining the fiction of Cinnaminson, Dorrance had ensured that Ethel would receive exactly what he chose to give her, and not a dollar more. He had even asked her to sign a statement before his death, confirming that their legal residence was New Jersey. She signed it. The will was not a gesture of generosity. It was an instrument of control. It told the family what to own, how to own it, and what would happen if they disobeyed. It created a structure that would hold for decades, binding children who were still in school and grandchildren who had not yet been born. Jack Dorrance was 11 years old. The Philadelphia Record described him as the nearest thing to a reigning earl or duke that the nation possessed. He had just inherited 1/4 of the largest privately held food company in America, his grandfather's clock, and a set of rules he had never agreed to follow. What those rules did to a boy who grew up knowing exactly what he was and exactly what he was not allowed to become is the story of the next 30 years. At Princeton University, Jack Dorrance drove a car fitted with tear gas jets. Not a choice, a precaution, against kidnapping. He had arrived at Princeton from St. George's School in Newport, Rhode Island. He majored in geology, graduated in 1941, enlisted in the Signal Corps, served in China, rose from private to captain. After the war, he reported to the factory floor in Camden, not as an executive, as a worker, learning the operation from the ground up. His father had not intended for him to run the company. The will gave Jack ownership, not authority. The old man had watched too many heirs fail in the executive chair. The structure he left behind reflected that caution. Campbell was led first by Jack's uncle Arthur, then by a series of non-family executives. Jack spent more than a decade working through the ranks, floor foreman, assistant treasurer, aide to the president, before he was named chairman of the board in 1962. He held that position for 22 years. During that time, Campbell sold stock to the public for the first time, in 1954. The company expanded into frozen foods, restaurants, and international markets. But Jack did not see himself as a builder. He was a guardian. One friend put it simply. Jack felt conscious that his father had made the money and he had not. He did not find great joy in being rich. He found it as embarrassing as it was fun. Jack married twice. His first marriage ended in divorce in 1963. He remarried and settled in Gladwin on the main line, the same stretch of Pennsylvania where Woodcrest had once stood. He had 3 children, a son named John Thompson Dorrance III, known since childhood as Ippy, and 2 younger children, Mary Alice and Bennett. All 3 attended the University of Arizona. Their photographs were absent from their yearbooks. Jack was private, and he drank, carrying forward a pattern his father had established at Woodcrest in the evenings, running a company that made him wealthier every quarter, refusing every banker who came to the door. He told his children almost nothing about the company or the fortune that awaited them. In 1984, he surprised shareholders at the annual meeting by announcing in a single offhand sentence that he would step down as chairman. He remained on the board. He stayed active at headquarters. 5 years later, on April 9, 1989, he died of a heart attack at his home in Bryn Mawr. He was 70 years old. His 3 children moved from receiving quarterly trust distributions to holding direct ownership of roughly 1/3 of the Campbell Soup Company. The fortune their grandfather had locked inside the 35-page will now belonged to them. Jack Dorrance had spent his life protecting something he had not built, managing something he had not chosen, and drinking in the long shadow of a man who had designed the cage before the occupant was born. The Philadelphia Record had once called him the nearest thing to a reigning earl or duke that the nation possessed. What it had not said was the other half of that sentence. An earl rules his estate. A prisoner maintains it. Jack had tried in his final years to prepare the next generation for what was coming. He had not tried hard enough. Within months of his death, a secret plan emerged that would have erased the Campbell name entirely. A ski resort in Vail, Colorado, sometime in 1989. A family member mentioned to a neighbor that Campbell Soup needed a new chief executive. The neighbor knew someone. He suggested the head of Quaker Oats. From that chance conversation on a ski slope came a proposal that would have merged Campbell with Quaker Oats, created the second-largest food company in America behind only Philip Morris, moved the headquarters from Camden to Chicago, and reduced the Dorrance family from majority owners to minority shareholders. It was called Project Toad, and it nearly worked. 3 weeks before Project Toad took shape, Jack Dorrance had gathered his children, nieces, and nephews at the Greenbrier Hotel in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. A 3-day retreat, part family reunion, part business seminar. The heirs toured the operations, asked questions, mingled with executives. Jack watched from a distance and felt, for the first time, cautiously hopeful. He was dead less than 2 weeks later. The 9 Dorrance cousins who now controlled a majority of Campbell Soup were not a unified family. They were 3 separate branches with separate grievances. Jack's children, Ippy, Mary Alice, and Bennett, held the largest combined stake. The older cousins, Dorrance Hamilton and Hope Van Buren, descended from Jack's sister Eleanor, held a smaller but significant share. A third group, descendants of the other sisters, fell somewhere in between. Much of the family's wealth was locked in Campbell stock, inherited free of tax. But the stock was also a trap. Earnings had been flat for years under a chief executive whose expansion strategy had produced little return. The cousins who wanted to sell faced a hard arithmetic. If enough of them dumped shares on the open market, the price would collapse. The only way to extract full value was to sell the company itself. Project Toad moved quickly and quietly. When Bennett Dorrance and their cousin George Strawbridge learned what was being negotiated without their consent, they placed a conference call to the chairman and killed it. Toad was dead. The rift was not. 3 dissident branches, holding roughly 17% of the company's stock, filed papers with the Securities and Exchange Commission signaling their intent to sell. They hired Arthur Lyman, the Manhattan attorney who had interrogated Oliver North during the Iran-Contra hearings, and sent him to Campbell headquarters with a message. Find a way to satisfy everyone, or we force a sale. Jack's 3 children held firm. They controlled enough stock to block any transaction. But blocking a sale was not the same as fixing a company. In late 1989, the board recruited David W. Johnson, an Australian-born executive who had previously turned around Gerber Products. Johnson restructured operations, closed underperforming businesses, and within 2 years had improved earnings enough to quiet the dissidents. By January of 1990, the immediate crisis had passed. The dissidents never changed their minds, but for the moment the center held. Ippy, Mary Alice, and Bennett had done what their grandfather's will had demanded. They had refused to sell. John Thompson Dorrance's 35-page document had survived its first real test. What none of them could have predicted was what the eldest of the 3 would do next. The rancher from Wyoming who had fought hardest to keep the company in the family was already doing the math. And the math was leading him somewhere his grandfather had traveled before. Away from the tax collector. Away from the country. John Thompson Dorrance III had not been raised to be a businessman. He had been raised to disappear, and for 15 years he had managed it perfectly. Devil's Tower, eastern Wyoming, 18,000 acres of open grassland, far from Camden, far from the Philadelphia main line, far from the Dorrance name. He raised Brangus cattle under a brand he called IPY, a shortened version of a childhood nickname that had come from a small boy trying to pronounce the Roman numeral after his own name. The sound had stuck. For 15 years, Ippy Dorrance lived as a rancher. He married a woman named Gundel Sock. They had 2 sons. His home was a 3-story chalet filled with mounted game. He was comfortable. Not wealthy, not in any way the Dorrance name would suggest. His father's trust provided a quarterly stipend of $100,000, roughly $400,000 per year, a generous sum by any ordinary measure. It bore no resemblance to the fortune that sat locked in Campbell's soup stock, waiting for Jack to die. When his father's heart stopped in April of 1989, everything changed. Ippy's share of the company was suddenly worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His income jumped to $87,000 a day in dividends alone. He joined the Campbell board and surprised everyone. He was intense, unpredictable, deeply engaged. He flew at his own expense to inspect operations in Hong Kong, Spain, and Argentina. One director described it simply. For Ippy, it was a mission. He had fought to keep the company in the family. He had helped kill Project Toad. And now he was staring at a tax code that would, upon his own death, take more than half of everything he had just inherited. The math was straightforward. Under American law, his estate would owe the federal government 55% of its value. On a fortune measured in hundreds of millions, that meant his children would lose more than half their inheritance to the Internal Revenue Service. His grandfather had tried to game the same system by maintaining a false address in New Jersey. It had cost the family $34 million. He chose a different approach. He decided to leave the country. In the early 1990s, Ippy invested $1.5 million to plant trees on roughly 1,000 acres of land in Ireland. Under Irish law at the time, foreign nationals who made qualifying investments could apply for citizenship. Ippy met the requirements. In 1995, he appeared before an Irish judge, swore his fidelity, and became a citizen of the Republic of Ireland. Then he walked into the United States Embassy in Dublin and signed a one-page document renouncing his American nationality. He was 51 years old. The consequences were immediate and deliberate. In Ireland, the estate tax rate was 2%. He could still visit the Wyoming ranch, which he had transferred to his sons 2 years earlier. He could still attend Campbell board meetings in Camden, but he could not spend more than 120 days a year on American soil without risking taxation as a resident. In November of 1996, he sold his Campbell Soup shares. The transaction was worth $720 million. He settled into a Georgian townhouse in Dublin, spent winters at a private estate in Lyford Key in the Bahamas, and largely vanished from public life. Washington reacted with fury. Representative Patricia Schroeder attacked him from the floor of the House. President Clinton proposed an exit tax aimed specifically at wealthy Americans who renounced their citizenship to avoid estate taxes. Ippy Dorrance became the most prominent example of a new kind of American. Not someone fleeing persecution, not someone fleeing poverty, someone fleeing the tax code. The irony was difficult to ignore. 65 years earlier, his grandfather had maintained a house he never lived in to avoid estate inheritance tax. It had backfired spectacularly. Now the grandson had abandoned an entire country for the same reason. The instinct was identical, only the scale had changed. Remove what is unnecessary. This time the thing removed was a passport. While Ippy was signing that document in Dublin, his sister was sitting on a different kind of board, in a different kind of arena, and refusing to go anywhere at all. Chester County, Pennsylvania. Rolling farmland, stone fences, the same hills that had shaped the Philadelphia Main Line for 2 centuries. Mary Alice Dorrance was born here on February 3, 1950, the middle child of Jack Dorrance and his second wife, Angeline. She joined the Bridal Veil Pony Club in Gladwin as a girl. The bond she formed with horses in those early years never loosened. By her 20s, she was running a boarding and training facility in Arizona, coaching young riders and founding both the Tucson Dressage Club and the Saguaro Pony Club. In 1976, she returned to Pennsylvania and founded Iron Spring Farm in Coatesville. European warmbloods were still largely unknown in the United States. American breeders had little access to the bloodlines that dominated international dressage. Mary Alice changed that. She began importing Dutch warmblood stallions from the Netherlands. Over the next 4 decades, she brought some of the most influential sport horse sires in the world to American soil. Roulette became one of the most recognized stallions in the country, excelling at both Grand Prix jumping and dressage. She established the Roulette Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting dressage education across the United States. Winston, Sebastian, Consul, Contango. Contango alone won 33 Grand Prix events and multiple national championships. Mary Alice was not simply a breeder who watched from the fence line. She competed. With a stallion named Rampal, she earned a place on the United States Olympic shortlist and helped prove that American-bred horses could perform at the highest international level. Over the course of her career, she accumulated more than 87 victories at the Grand Prix level. She earned her bronze, silver, and gold medals from the United States Dressage Federation. She won top honors at the Royal Dressage Festival and the USDF Festival of Champions. She was among the first to import approved Frisian stallions for high-performance dressage at a time when the breed was rarely seen in international competition. In early 2025, the Royal Warmblood Studbook of the Netherlands honored her with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Iron Spring Farm eventually expanded to include a winter facility in Wellington, Florida. The horses she bred and imported went on to compete at the Olympics, the Paralympics, and the FEI World Cup Dressage Final. Their offspring won medals at World Driving Championships and performed at Aachen, Hickstead, and Spruce Meadows. What had started as a single farm in Coatesville became one of the most respected equestrian breeding programs in the world. But horses were only half of her life. The other half belonged to Camden. Mary Alice was elected to the Campbell Board of Directors in 1990, 1 year after her father died. She served longer than any other director in the company's history. Her 18% stake made her the single largest individual shareholder. Forbes valued her fortune at $4.1 billion. She sat on the governance and compensation committees. She attended meetings with the quiet consistency of someone who understood that her presence was not ceremonial. It was structural. As long as Mary Alice Malone held her shares and her seat, the Dorrance family retained its grip on the company. She was intensely private. She gave almost no interviews. She made no public statements about the family conflicts of the late 1980s. When a former cook and traveling companion named Agnes O'Brien attempted to extort her in 2009, threatening to publish a tell-all book about her personal life unless she paid $1 million, Mary Alice went straight to the authorities. The FBI investigated. O'Brien was arrested in August of 2010, charged with extortion, and pleaded guilty the following May. Mary Alice said nothing publicly about the matter. No statement, no comment. No acknowledgement in any forum. The silence was deliberate and total. She had 2 daughters, Mary Alice Malone Jr. and Catherine Dorrance Malone. She raised them in the same Chester County countryside where she had grown up, among the same hills and horse farms that had shaped her own childhood. Mary Alice Dorrance Malone died peacefully at home on June 16, 2025. She was 75 years old. The company described her as a highly committed director whose knowledge of the company's history and culture was invaluable. Within weeks, her eldest daughter was appointed to fill her seat on the board. The transition was seamless. The seat passed the way a title passes in an old European house, not because it was owed, but because someone had to hold it. The money was inherited. The horses were chosen. John Thompson Dorrance had written a will to bind his bloodline to a company. He had not written anything about what they were allowed to love along the way. Mary Alice found something he could not take from her, and she never let go of it. The youngest of Jack's 3 children had watched his sister hold the line and his brother cross the ocean. He had done neither. Bennett Dorrance had simply stayed and made himself indispensable in ways that required no headlines. Paradise Valley, Arizona, a wealthy enclave tucked against Camelback Mountain on the eastern edge of Phoenix. Not Camden, not the Philadelphia Main Line, not Dublin or Wyoming. Bennett Dorrance was the youngest of Jack's 3 children, and in many ways the least visible. He did not breed Olympic horses. He did not renounce his citizenship. He moved to Arizona after college and stayed there, building a life that looked nothing like the Dorrance name would suggest. In the early 1980s, he co-founded DMB Associates, a real estate development firm based in Scottsdale. The company built master-planned residential communities and commercial properties across Arizona, California, and Utah. It was successful, respected in the industry, entirely unrelated to soup. Bennett had no interest in running Campbell, but he understood, better than most of his relatives, that someone in the family had to keep the coalition together. He joined the Campbell board in 1989, the same year his father died. He was in his early 30s. The company was in crisis. Cousins were threatening to sell. A secret merger had just been killed. The family voting trust was dissolving. Bennett stepped into that chaos not as a deal maker or a corporate strategist, as a mediator. He held a 15% stake in the company. He used it the way a diplomat uses leverage, quietly, consistently, and without drawing attention to himself. At a family business conference in the mid-1990s, Bennett described his role in terms that no one in the audience would have envied. He called himself the default leader of the Dorrance family. No one else could do it, he said, and no one else was interested. The title was not flattering. It was accurate. Ippy had left the country. Mary Alice was focused on her horses and her board seat. The cousins from the other branches of the family were scattered, some disengaged, some actively hostile. Bennett was the one who made the phone calls, arranged the meetings, worked to keep the 33% family stake voting as a block rather than fragmenting into a dozen competing interests. He lived in Paradise Valley. His life there was comfortable but deliberately low profile. He avoided the press. He did not appear on magazine covers or celebrity wealth lists with the frequency of his siblings. When Forbes estimated his net worth at roughly $3.3 billion, he offered no comment. His work on the Campbell board was similarly understated. He served for more than 3 decades, from 1989 to 2022, attending meetings in Camden with the regularity of a man who treated the obligation as non-negotiable. He did not give speeches about the company's direction. He did not publicly challenge management. He did not stage boardroom confrontations. He voted, he consulted, and he ensured that the Dorrance family's interests were represented at every critical juncture. When activist investors pressed the company to consider strategic alternatives, Bennett was part of the family bloc that held firm. In 2022, he stepped down from the board and handed the seat to his son, Bennett Dorrance, Jr. The transition mirrored what Mary Alice would do 3 years later, passing her own seat to her daughter. A pattern was forming. The third generation was yielding to the fourth, and the mechanism was the same each time. A board seat moved from parent to child, carrying with it the unspoken expectation that the new director would protect what the family had built. Bennett's contribution to the dynasty was not dramatic. There were no 87 Grand Prix victories, no Georgian townhouses in Dublin, no congressional hearings. What he provided was continuity. For more than 30 years, he sat between the family members who wanted to sell and the ones who wanted to hold. Between the cousins who had lost interest and the siblings who cared too much. And he kept the structure from collapsing. It was the kind of work that no one notices until it stops being done. The Dorrance fortune required someone like Bennett, not a visionary, not a rebel, not a horseman, a manager. Someone willing to fly to Camden 4 times a year, sit in a conference room, review the numbers, and fly home. Someone willing to pick up the phone when a cousin in Connecticut wanted to liquidate her shares and talk her out of it. Someone willing to be the default leader because the alternative was no leader at all. By the time he handed the seat to his son, the family still controlled roughly 1/3 of the company, less than the 59% they had held when Jack died. But enough to block a hostile takeover, enough to influence the board, enough to ensure that the name Dorrance still carried weight in Camden. That outcome was not inevitable. It was the result of decades of unglamorous, largely invisible work. Most of that work had been done by the youngest of 3, sitting in a house in Paradise Valley, making calls that no one outside the family would ever hear about. John Thompson Dorrance had designed a structure meant to last beyond him. He had not designed the man who would be required to maintain it. That was left to chance. And chance produced Bennett. The family had held the company together through fracture, flight, and succession. But while the Dorrances were fighting to control the name on the corporate filing, the world had already decided what the name on the can meant. And it had nothing to do with tax law. Los Angeles, the summer of 1962. A 33-year-old commercial illustrator named Andy Warhol exhibited 32 small canvases at the Ferris Gallery on La Cienega Boulevard. Each painting depicted a single can of Campbell's condensed soup, one for every variety the company sold: tomato, chicken noodle, cream of celery, pepper pot. They were displayed on a narrow wooden shelf that ran the length of the gallery wall, arranged like products on a supermarket aisle. The art world did not know what to make of them. A gallery across the street placed actual Campbell cans in its window and sold them for 60 cents apiece, mocking the idea that a soup can belonged in an exhibition. Critics dismissed the show as shallow, a stunt, a joke. Sales were poor. The gallery's co-owner, Irving Bloom, ultimately decided to keep the entire set himself. He paid $1,000 for all 32 paintings. 34 years later, he sold them to the Museum of Modern Art in New York for $15 million. Warhol had not chosen Campbell at random. He said he had eaten the same lunch every day for 20 years. The red and white can was the most familiar object in his kitchen. And familiarity was the point. By painting it with the precision of a commercial draftsman and hanging it in a fine art gallery, he forced a question that had no comfortable answer. Where does commerce end and culture begin? Is a soup can art if you put it on a shelf in a gallery? Is it still a product if you put it on a wall in a museum? The questions were not rhetorical. They changed the direction of American art. Before Warhol, the dominant movement was abstract expressionism, painters like Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning, who celebrated the individual gesture, the visible brushstroke, the artist as tortured genius. Warhol rejected all of it. He traced projected images onto canvas with the mechanical precision of an advertising layout. He smoothed away every trace of his own hand. The soup cans looked almost printed. That was deliberate. If mass production had come to define American life, then art should look like mass production too. What Warhol almost certainly did not know was the story behind the label he was painting. The red and white design had been chosen in 1898 by a Campbell executive named Herberton Williams, who had attended a football game at Cornell and admired the team's colors. The gold medallion pressed into the center of the label commemorated a bronze medal the company had won at the 1900 Paris Exposition. Both details were more than 60 years old when Warhol set up his easel. The label had barely changed in all that time. It was already an artifact of American commercial history before it became an artifact of American art. But there is something the gallery walls never showed. The can that Warhol painted did not make itself. In Camden, New Jersey, in a factory that ran 8 weeks straight during the summer harvest, processing tomatoes from sunrise to shutdown, workers filled that can. They sealed it, labeled it, loaded it onto freight cars bound for every state in the Union. They did not earn $15 million. Most earned wages that Dorrance's own records would later show running to roughly a few dollars an hour, the invisible economy behind the iconic label. The copy sold for more than the company would ever pay its workers in a generation. The irony deepened over the decades. In 1962, Warhol was struggling for recognition, desperate to break out of commercial illustration work that paid his bills but earned no respect from the art establishment. Campbell, by contrast, was among the most successful companies in America. By the end of the century, the balance had shifted. Warhol's paintings of soup cans were worth more per square inch than anything the Campbell Soup Company had ever produced. The copy had become more valuable than the original. When visitors go to Warhol's grave in Bethel Park, Pennsylvania, they do not leave flowers. They leave cans of Campbell soup. Tomato, mostly. The cans sit on the headstone, rain-spotted and sun-faded, placed there by strangers who understand that the gesture means something, even if they cannot quite explain what. It is tribute and joke and cultural commentary, all at once. Warhol would have appreciated that. He spent his career blurring the line between sincerity and irony, and in death, the blur continues. The red and white label that a company executive copied from a college football uniform more than a century ago hangs in the most prestigious modern art museum in the world. The medallion from Paris is still on the can. The design is still on the shelf. and somewhere between the grocery store and the gallery wall, a 10-cent can of condensed soup became the most recognized image in American pop art. The Dorrances never commissioned the paintings. They never asked for them. They never needed to. John Thompson Dorrance had spent his life controlling everything he could reach. The one thing he could not reach was what people would make of his invention after he was gone. The can outlasted the man. The image outlasted the dynasty. And neither the will, nor the lawyers, nor the 35 pages had anything to say about it. In November of 2024, the company quietly changed its name. After more than a century, the word soup disappeared from the corporate identity. What remained, and what it means for the fourth generation now holding the shares, is the final question of this investigation. The can is still red on top, white on the bottom. The gold medallion from Paris still pressed into the center of the label. 128 years after a young chemist in Camden figured out how to remove the water from a pot of soup, his invention still sits on shelves in kitchens across America. It costs more than 10 cents now. But the design is almost unchanged. The script is still cursive, the metal is still there. The company that produced it now generates $9.6 billion in annual revenue. It owns Pepperidge Farm, Goldfish, V8, Swanson, Pace, and Prego. In 2018, it paid $6.1 billion for Snyder's Lance. In 2024, it added Sovos brands for $2.9 billion, bringing Rayo's pasta sauce into the portfolio. Each acquisition pushed the company further from soup and closer to the model of a diversified packaged food conglomerate. The red and white can is still on the shelf. It is no longer the center of the business. The company is still headquartered in Camden, New Jersey, in the same city where a 24-year-old chemist once set up a laboratory and offered to work for $7.50 a week. The Dorrance family no longer holds a majority. Decades of estate settlements, stock sales, and generational dilution have reduced the combined family stake to roughly 33%, a fraction of the 59% they controlled when Jack died in 1989. But through strategic board positions and coordinated voting, the descendants of the inventor still exercise more influence over the company than any other group. Bennett Dorrance Jr. sits on the board. Mary Alice Malone Jr. joined after her mother's death. Ippy remains in Dublin, a billionaire several times over, no longer a shareholder, still connected to the dynasty by name. There are now approximately 87 living descendants of John Thompson Dorrance, scattered across 3 countries. Some have never met. A few have never visited the headquarters. The family that once gathered at the Greenbrier in matching red and white bandanas now communicates, when it communicates at all, through lawyers and trust officers. And yet the instruction written into a 35-page will nearly a century ago still echoes through every boardroom vote and every quarterly earnings call. Do not sell. Do not lose control. Pass the fortune forward. 3 generations obeyed, each in their own way. The grandfather built the company and refused every offer to take it public. His son served as chairman for 22 years and never diversified the family holdings. Jack's children split into 3 directions, one to Ireland, one to the horse farms of Pennsylvania, one to the desert of Arizona. But all 3 kept their shares, or ensured their seats passed to the next generation. The 4th generation is now in place. They have inherited not just money, they have inherited an obligation that none of them chose, and none of them can easily refuse. The will did not merely distribute assets, it imposed a purpose. And the weight of that purpose, the expectation that each generation would sacrifice something to keep the company whole, has shaped every major decision the family has made since 1930. This is the final diagnosis. John Thompson Dorrance came to Camden with a single question: What happens when you take something out? He removed the water from the soup. He removed the competitors from his market. He removed the partners from his company. He removed the government from his estate. And in the end, he removed the freedom from his bloodline. The fortune stands at $15 billion. The will says hold. Whether the fourth generation can hold together as long as the can has, that is a question no 35 pages can answer. If you enjoyed this deep investigation into the Gilded Age architecture and the dark machinery behind American dynasties, please leave a comment below and let us know which family or estate you would like us to examine next. And if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe. The next investigation is already underway.